Hello, welcome back to Janus Academy. This is our series on history of art, general introduction to history of art. This is the second lecture in the series. Today we are going to be talking about Venus of Tintin. This is a figurine, I would say an artifact rather than a work of art. We'll be talking about that a bit later. That is estimated to be between 500,000 and 300,000 years old. For the purposes of this particular lecture, we are assuming a more conservative estimate that it is older. So we're going to be talking about it as if it were 500,000 years old. Now you can see that this is an incredible time scope that we're dealing with here. That it's 200,000 years. This is longer than our entire civilization. Well, 5 times 18 or 15, depending on how you want to see it. But yes, we're trying to situate this properly. Now, it's quite important for us to do so because we are talking about very important period of human history. We're talking about the emergence of the Homo genus, and we're talking about how this Homo genus develops. And also we're talking about the possibility of this being at the very threshold of the Homo sapiens stage of human development. Now, before we get to all of these things, we would like to describe the object, say a couple of words about it, general intro, so to speak, and we would like to, visually identify the whole thing and contextualize it. First of all, we can say that this is the quartzite object that is 6 centimeters long, 2.6 centimeters wide, and 1.2 centimeters thick. So it's really tiny. It's about this big. Really, really small, which takes us back to what we were talking about before, how these objects that come from the periods of time before the sedentary lifestyle, before the Neolithic agricultural revolution, could have only been very small. This is going to be the case for a next couple of lectures. It will take us some time until we get to really large things. And this is not going to happen while we're talking about the Paleolithic, while we're talking about nomadic lifestyle. This particular object was discovered fairly recently. I mean, if you think about year of 1999 as being fairly recent, I think it was, because I remember it very well. I'm old enough to see that as something that happened recently. And it was discovered in today's Morocco. It was discovered about 10 kilometers away from the city of Tintin, which is how it got its name. And it was discovered in a riverbed. If you look at this figurine, we can assume that it's a figurine that has been also shaped by nature. The previous item of our research, the first lecture that we've done, was a 3-million-year-old pebble that was entirely shaped by natural forces, and then that was recognized by proto-humans that found it. We can say that it's a similar situation here, and we're going to come back to this a bit later, because while this is mostly shaped by natural forces, it's also partially shaped by a human hand, or a proto-human hand, depending how you want to say it. But let's say, just to posit it a bit broadly. And it's a very small object that is quite peculiar in as much as it really looks like a human body. It looks like a human being, of course, heavily stylized. It's not incredibly realistic, but it is, I wouldn't say fashioned, because we can't really tell that it was fashioned with a purpose, especially not with such purpose, but it looks like a human body where we can identify head, 2 arms, 2 legs, and the torso. And if we think about the period where it came from, we could argue that it's actually incredibly similar to the human body. It doesn't have feet, it doesn't have hands, it has arms, and it has legs. We call it the Venus, and this is, I guess, an interesting thing that we have to explain a bit better, because we assume that all of these female figurines are connected somehow to the appellation of Venus. Now, we have to explain this because these are all so incredibly old that they predate the cult of Venus, meaning the Roman goddess of love and of beauty and all such things, by tens of thousands of years. So we need to say right up front that this has nothing to do with the cult of Venus as such. We also need to make a distinction, and we're going to say the same thing about the next lecture in our series, that this also has nothing to do with Venuses from much later on. Venuses like that of Willendorf or Lespuge or many others such. They are much, much younger. Those Venuses come back from, let's say, 25 or 30,000 years ago. These particular Venuses that we're talking about today, especially Venus of Tintin, is much, much older. And the only reason why we call it Venus really is because we assume that it's a woman. So this is a bit of a 19th century convention that if it's a woman, if it's naked, then we're going to call it Venus. And it's a very broad appellation that, again, doesn't have to have anything to do with the actual Roman deity of Venus. We'll have ample time to discuss that, and we'll have ample time to discuss the connection between Venus and Aphrodite and Ishtar, because there will be an entire lecture dedicated to Ishtar. So this is something that is very near and dear to our hearts. But just to say that in this particular case, we're talking about a very general, broad, to a certain extent metaphoric appellation that has nothing to do with either the much later prehistoric figurines that we call Venuses or the actual deity, Roman deity of Venus. But it is called Venus of Tantan. We've explained why, we explained where it came from. The thing that is really impressive about this is that it's another example of pareidolia, that we recognize, well, not a face, because it doesn't have a face, and this is a very important thing that we're going to come back to, but we recognize the shape of a human body where there is not supposed to be one. Again, if we assume that this was made by natural forces, that this is a spontaneously formed, well, I wouldn't really say sculpture, it wasn't sculpted per se, but a stone, let's put it that way, we recognize in it something that is not necessarily meant to be there. So when we interpret this thing, we interpret it basically recognizing a pattern, recognizing an image that is not necessarily there. And this is a very interesting line of inquiry that we may come back to later. Now, we need to say, if we're talking about this particular period of time, as we do, that this is an object, an artifact that dates to 500,000 years ago, 500,000 years. And this is really important to mention, that we have this general idea of the stages of humanity, how we evolved and how we developed into being Homo sapiens, which is where we are now. We've crossed a lot of different thresholds, we've crossed a lot of different checkpoints and stages of development. Now, it is really important to state that not all of our ancestors made it in the evolutionary terms speaking. A lot of them just died out. A lot of them did not manage to persist and to, well, persevere long enough. If we're talking about Homo habilis, for example, they have completely gone extinct, and there's no more Homo habilis around, not to my knowledge at least. If we're talking about the Neanderthal, which comes much later than Homo habilis, it's a similar situation. Now, you could say that Neanderthals were able to breed with some of the Homo sapienses, and therefore they have survived to a certain extent, but in a fairly lateral manner, because some people to this day have traces of Neanderthal DNA in them. It's always something to the size of, I don't know, 2% or 3%. So we could say that they remain, but very marginally so in our broader genetic pool. But the point that I'm trying to make with this is that we don't necessarily know if a proto-human that, well, made this to a certain extent, or that dealt with this artifact, remained if this particular branch of humanity made it, if they survived long enough to have their ancestors be present in today's world. And this is really the case with a lot of different branches of hominines and with a lot of different hominids. A lot of them didn't make it. So that is just a sad fact. And this is something that we need to address if we are talking about this particular work of, well, this particular artifact, work of nature rather than a work of art, and if we are to properly contextualize it and to properly understand it. There is a very important thing to address here when it comes to Venus of Tantan, and that is really basically something that was very important for the previous item, and it's going to be very important for the next item. And this is the question of chronology, how we situate this particular period in the great schema of development of humanity. Because some incredibly important things have happened in the time span between the two. The previous item that we've discussed took us back 3 million years ago, very, very far. This one takes us 500,000 years ago. The difference between the two is 2.5 million years. Now, a lot can happen in 2.5 million years, as you can imagine. Evolution can be traced, can be visible, although evolution is very slow, but in this particular time frame, we can measure it, we can see tangible changes. And one of the most important ones is basically the invention of fire or usage of fire. I think usage is a better term because I don't think we really invented fire. I think fire existed just as such. But we were able to hone it and we were able to instrumentalize it in a way. We are talking about the period where we start using fire on a relatively constant, in a relatively constant manner. Now, we previously said that we situate this to 800,000 years in the past. And if we're talking about something that comes 500,000 years ago, then we're talking about a period of time where we are pretty certain about usage of fire. So the fire is something that has become a staple, more or less. But what is also important to mention when we're talking about these things, big evolutionary changes, but as well as cultural changes that are on a much smaller scale, we are not always talking about instantaneous, synchronous, momentary adoption. Now, what do I mean by this? If we say that our ancestors started using fire 800,000 years ago, that doesn't mean that the whole of planet just started using fire in that particular period. Indeed, if you take a look at different studies and different, assumptions and different archaeological evidence regarding this, you can say that we've started dabbling with fire much earlier than that, and that it took some time for fire to be understood and to be finally adopted, and this took hundreds of thousands of years. So we can say that when it comes to this is a period from where we can talk about the more global adoption of fire. You could say the same thing about bipedality, the fact that humanity started walking upright. This didn't happen overnight, and it didn't happen at the same time for all of the species of hominins. Some of them took less, some of them took more time, but generally speaking, we say that after a certain period of time, most hominids became bipedal, which meant that we started walking upright. We started using our front legs, if you will, for things other than walking. We started using our hands and our fingers. We had the development of opposable thumbs. This all contributed vastly in our evolution, and this made us into who we are. The point is that if we're talking about the difference between this particular artifact and the previous one being 3 million years ago, this one being 500,000 years ago, we're talking about the period before usage of fire and after usage of fire. So this is a big difference. It's monumental. What is also important to say is that we are talking about the beginning of the Homo species. We situate Homo species basically to 2.9 million years ago. Therefore, meaning that when we were talking about Makapansgat's pebble, we were talking about, species of hominins that was before the Homo species. And if we're talking about Venus of Tantan, we are already talking about the Homo species. And this is, again, a big difference. So something that is really important to mention. Now, when we are talking about fire, this is something we addressed previously, but we need to come back to it because it's even more important in this particular case. The fire is not just something that we use to prepare food. It's not just something that helps us in digesting food externally, and therefore helps us to use proteins in a more biologically readily available state, and which then in turn grows our brains and makes our brains, become as they are today, more or less. Fire is an incredibly important phenomenon as a socially cohesive agent because people gather around the fire and they share stories around the fire, they share meals around fire. Fire is also a protective tool. We can use it to protect ourselves from wild animals, from wild beasts. They don't like fire particularly. They don't like being burned by fire. Arguably, no one does. So a fire is this incredibly useful thing that helps us immensely. Now, you could argue that it helps us most importantly with our food, but you could argue that it helps us with our protection. It helps us with having greater agency over our environment. It helps us in hunting. It pretty much helps us with everything. But again, it's something that provides warmth and something that provides space for storytelling. It's great for communities. Now, this is all important because a lot of the development of our consciousness has to do with fire. And again, if we're talking about a period that is 500,000 years ago, we're talking about general broad adoption of fire. And another thing that we are talking about here that is really, really important and is, well, fairly closely connected to the question of fire is the question of tool development. Now, this is supremely interesting because when we were talking about it in a different course, what is art, we were talking about the importance of tools and the importance of skill. And this whole idea of art, amongst other things, being the way in which we understand the world around us. Now, we can make this analogy, and people have done this with great success, where we argue that development of humanity, really as such, has a lot to do with development of tools, that we are animals that use tools. This is how we define ourselves. And that if we're talking about this particular period of time, we're talking about the usage of tools that becomes broadly adopted. Now, we can say that these things develop, I would argue, almost simultaneously. Of course, this is only metaphorical, but it's a very interesting analogy to be made, and it's a very interesting analogy that can help us understand the development of humanity much better. We can talk about the development of consciousness as such, and then we can talk about development of tools, and then development of art. Again, with all the possible distance that we can assume, saying that we can't really talk about art in today's terms before the Greeks. So this is very, very late in the game. So when we're talking about art, we are talking about an anachronism because we are looking at a certain object from today's contemporary perspective, and we label it as art. Even if we're talking about certain medieval objects, we couldn't really label them as art, certainly not the way we understand it today. And even more so if we're talking about some prehistoric artifact that has exactly nothing to do with today's civilization or today's state of humanity as it is. But the point is that these three things develop and they influence one another. That if we look at art, or in its most primitive, basic form, and if we look at the tools and how we make the tools and how we use those tools, and if we look at how our consciousness develops around these two things and many others, we are looking at the processes that are incredibly important and that are necessary to understand those other two. We need to understand how our consciousness develops if we want to understand creation of tools. We need to understand how tools and usage of tools develop if we want to understand our consciousness. You get the point. And the same thing goes when we're talking about art. Now, you can say that making tools really is an art form in itself. And by definition, this would be correct because you would be talking about applied arts. You could say that fork is a tool in a way. A hammer is a tool. I mean, I'm not going to give any other examples. You get the point. But these can be artistic. They can be incredibly well made. They can be beautiful. We can see a statue that's shaped as a fork that we don't use as a fork. We just look at it and we treat it as a statue. You could say the same thing about any other tool that you can think of. There is this incredibly long tradition of making arms in an incredibly aesthetic, complex, and refined, sophisticated manner. You can go to any museum of arms and you can see incredibly beautiful swords and daggers, or even pistols or rifles or even cannons. You can see all these tools of war, tools of aggression being incredibly beautifully done. So you could argue, of course, this is applied arts. And if we're talking about stone tools, we can say, yes, it's applied art in a way, very crude, perhaps very primitive, but perhaps not so. Now, I would argue that any of these tools took more genius and more creative leaps than any of the sequent things that were done. You're looking at an incredibly beautiful rifle, let's say, and you say, okay, but when they made this rifle was already used, the person who made this incredibly sophisticated or ornate rifle didn't really necessarily invent anything new. I mean, they just took something that already existed and they made it nicer. But inventing these tools, I think, took like great leaps of creativity and effort and great efforts of abstract thought. Now, I want to go to the tool that is possibly the most important one in the entire history of humanity. If by any other standard, then just by the very fact that it's the longest tool that was ever used, or rather the tool that was used the longest in known recorded human history. We're talking about the Acheulean hand axe. This particular tool was used for roughly 1.5 1.5 million years without being considerably changed, without the change in size, the function, not to speak of aesthetics. I don't think it's an incredibly useful thing. But the point is that we've used this tool, for a very, very long period of time. It was that well designed that we didn't really need to make it evolve or anything. But this is something that is important if we're talking about this particular artifact, because this is something that was worked upon. Now, this is the great difference between Venus of Tantan and the pebble of Makapansgat, is that we have a solid bit of evidence suggesting that this is not a pure manoport. Broadly speaking, it is a manoport because most of this has been found in its original state, but then we see some intervention done on it. We see that there were grooves, side grooves that were added, possibly using stone tools. And this is really important that we use, again, stone on stone. We use a harder stone on softer stones. We use force of stone to influence another stone. And we already spoke about the sanctity of stone and how important it really was, if for no other reason than for the pure fact that it was instrumental in our survival, that we used stone tools, like the Acheulean hand axe, for example. We used it to process our food. We used it to hunt, to fight, to basically do all of the things that we can do with this particular tool. And it was very, very important, if not the most important thing in our survival and in our development. Now, this is something that we have to kind of understand if we go back to talking about the Homo genus and how it develops. We are talking about the genus in itself becoming a thing 2.9 million years ago, and then getting to the threshold of, I think most people would agree, roughly 300,000 years ago, where we can talk about Homo sapiens. Now, if we are to assume that this, we said it at the beginning, that this particular item is situated either in 500,000 years before current moment or 300,000 years before current moment. We have decided to opt for 500,000 years. But just for this one example, if we're talking about, Homo sapiens becoming a thing, it's roughly 300,000 years ago. But again, new research would suggest 350, 315,000. It really is very hard to establish the exact bracket there. This is all really important because if we're talking about the Homo genus, and then if we're talking about Homo sapiens as the penultimate stage of human development, we are talking about all of these questions of humanity that are older than, humanity in its latest or its penultimate stage. We are talking about all of these things that works of art make us question, like the question of identity, the question of the self, the difference between spirit and matter, the difference between body and soul, the difference between society and nature, or society and individual. What is especially important is the question of human versus other animals, or the rest of existence as such. Now, you could say that the previous item was drastically different, radically different really than this one, because the previous item was a face, or rather four faces, but let's say if you look at it from one side, you see one face. That was enough of a general depiction and enough of an abstracted depiction for us to be impossible to claim that it's female or male. We could say that it was therefore androgynous. And it was impossible to say that it was basically an animal or a human. And we said in the previous lecture that we did not necessarily differentiate ourselves from the general pool of existence. We did not see ourselves as an animal that is drastically different than all the other animals. Now, when we look at this particular figurine, we see that it's in a way inverse to the previous one, because this one is a body alone without a face. And it's quite interesting because there we have nothing but face, here we have everything but the face. If you look at this figurine, you see another thing that I find exceptionally interesting, and this is the fact that this figurine has, a head, but doesn't really have a differentiated face, and then doesn't really have hands, and it doesn't have feet. Now, why are these three so important? Well, they're connected in a way, because in history of art in general, we look at these three things as ways of identifying a being. We look at feet and we see the connection with the soil. We see all these telluric and Chthonian qualities. So we say that very large, very developed, or very present feet speak of terrestrial and telluric nature of that individual. We say that they're very carnal, they're very passionate, they're in their body a lot. Then we look at their face and we see, okay, this is where their soul is. The face is an expression of the soul, of identity, of who we are. We've explained this previously, talking about face extensively, that this is because that our brains are situated in our skulls, and most of our identity, or so we think, is situated in our brain. Now, hands are in the middle of this. They're our main interface, not for observing reality, that one is our face, but acting upon our reality. We use our fingers, especially our opposable thumbs, to act upon the world. And therefore, these three things, feet, hands, and face, they speak of an individual. They speak of an identity of the individual in a much more important way than the rest of the body does. Now, you could say that there are interesting anecdotes illustrating this point, that the face is more important than the rest of the body. I think I have mentioned this elsewhere in our course on What is Art, where you look at, let's say, the portraits of Louis XIV. He has many. And you can see that in some of the older portraits that depict him, let's say as a 65-year-old person, you can see that he was obviously too busy to pose for the entire portrait. So they would put in a young, well-built, handsome man to pose for his body, and then they would just paint his face, which then looks really funny. I'll try to illustrate this if I find the appropriate painting, because you would see the head of an old man that is generously filled with fat, and you can see this amazing young body of like a 25-year-old athlete, and then you see the head of a 65-year-old male that has been eating and drinking a lot his entire life. And you see that there's an obvious mismatch. Even the artistic endeavor, even artists trying to put it together didn't really succeed. So you have these things. But this tells us that obviously the face is more important than the body, and this happened very often. This happened with Roman emperors as well. When they didn't really bother to make entire statues of themselves, they would just sculpt a head, or they would have it sculpted rather than them sculpting it themselves, and then they would screw that head on top of an already existing body. So you could say that the body was like this generic idea of a Roman emperor, again, a powerful figure and all, and they would just screw the head of another emperor on top of it. So again, very funny. But it tells us that, there's a difference between a face and a body. The difference in our perception, the difference in how we perceive importance, and this is the difference that we need to be talking about here, because we are talking about the fact that this particular statue is nothing but the body, and the previous one was nothing but the head. And it's just an interesting thing to observe. Now, is this because our consciousness have evolved over the period of 2.5 million years, that we started being more aware of ourselves other than our faces, so we started including the rest of our bodies? This would be an interesting assumption, but then why would then we exclude the face? Why would there be no such thing as a face? Or we recognized this by pure accident. You could argue this would be a very cynical assumption, that we just found a pebble in nature that looked like a human face, and we're like, oh, this is cute, let's take it. And then 2.5 million years later, we found a pebble that looked like a human body. We're like, oh, okay, this is cute, so let's take this as well. The point is that we need to be aware of all of these things. You could really go as far as to say that there's a certain dichotomy between a face and the body. And this is present even in pop culture, in vernacular conversations about, to which extent a certain person, be they male or female, are pretty. So you say, oh, they have a nice face, but the body is so-so. Or the other way around, oh, they have an amazing body, but their face is eh. And we make a difference between these two. So we think that face has one set of values, one set of aesthetic acumen, let's put it that way, and the body another. And you could argue then we're not going to make this, we're not going to broaden this more than it needs to be, but you could argue that it's different because face is something that you're more or less born with, unless you decide to alter it with plastic surgery, but then that's a whole other thing. Whereas body is something you can work upon. You can work out, you can try to sculpt your body past what your birth given you, what your parents' DNA has given you. So there's a lot more you can do with your body than what you can do with your face. But the point is that we need to think about these particular things. Now, we could also assume that this figurine was chosen exactly because it didn't have a face. And this would put it in an interesting connection with a lot of the much later Venuses, like, again, famously Venus of Willendorf, I think is the most famous example, because that little figurine, again, has no face. It has like a beehive instead of a face. And there are many other figurines, again, these much later prehistoric Venuses than the one we're talking about now, that clearly have a very well-defined female body, but then explicitly no face. And this is almost a rule, not quite, because some of them do have faces, but not all of them. Most of them actually don't. And we see this development of Venuses in terms of how detailed their bodies are, and especially how sensual their bodies are. This is a whole other thing we're going to be talking about in the next lecture. But very little development in terms of their faces, which again is strange because we identify so much with our faces for all the reasons previously explained. And this is something that makes us think that the face, the head, but especially the face, perhaps is not that big of a deal. Perhaps it's not that important. And this is something that makes us then think that if we are to see these figurines a certain way, the absence of face would be a message, and it would be something that is intentionally communicated. Now, let's say that this is called the Venus of Tantan, and so therefore it's obviously a woman. We could say that the first thing that came to mind to a lot of anthropologists and a lot of archaeologists and a lot of art historians is that these are cults of fertility. Now, there's an entire other line of inquiry in anthropology saying that this is simply not truth. That's not true, and it's something we cannot state with certainty. We have no evidence for this. And I would agree with this. We don't have any evidence that these are fertility symbols, that are fertility fetishes. We just don't know. Maybe they are, maybe they are not. What we can say with certainty is that fertility doesn't really have the same role in society in the pre-sedentary and sedentary societies. Because in sedentary societies, we do a lot of agriculture. Actually, this is really how the whole thing is defined. And we are dependent on agriculture. We really cultivate the soil, and therefore we think about fertility as a broader agenda. We have animal husbandry. We want our animals to be fertile. We want them to reproduce. That way we have more animals. And back in the day, having a lot of animals meaning having a lot of wealth. Therefore, in the sedentary point of view, fertility is something that becomes very much associated with wealth. You want your field to be fertile. You want your soil to be fertile. You want your animals to be fertile, to reproduce. You want your male or female partners to be fertile, because that way you produce a lot of kids, and kids back in the day are labor. You need them to work your field or your animals. The more fertility you have, the more wealth you have. Now, this is not the case, of course, obviously, in the nomadic context, because we do not till the soil, we don't really have animal husbandry, we do not have the same connection with nature, nor we think about natural cycles and all the things that are associated to cults of fertility. It is basically the question of survival, because when we move around, we can't really have that many kids. You could say that if you live a nomadic life, you can have a kid once every 5 years or so. Because it takes time to rear one child, it takes time for that child to become sort of basically independent. So you can't really have this sedentary agricultural situation where one family has 12 or 15 kids, out of which 7 will not make it. Let's not go in that dark direction. This is not the case with nomadic communities. Nomadic families don't have a bunch of kids. They have much fewer number of kids because they can just not sustain as much in terms of feeding them and in terms of rearing them. Therefore, we do not have the same relationship with fertility. It's not quite that big of a deal in a pre-sedentary society, or even if it is big of a deal, because it's the question of survival, it's just not the same, because we don't, again, we don't till the soil, we don't do animal husbandry, certainly not at that scale. Now, we can say that this is a female figure, and if we're talking about, females, we're not only talking about fertility, of course, we're talking about many other things. And we're talking about this very interesting situation that we have a cult of womanhood, that we have cult of women. Now, this is especially present in, again, agrarian, sedentary, Neolithic context and post-Neolithic context, but also, obviously, in nomadic, Paleolithic context, deep prehistoric context. We can go back to one of our favorite art historians of all time, Camille Paglia, a person that has incredibly interesting ideas, even when we disagree with them, but they are, so interesting and fun to disagree with, which is a great quality. Camille Paglia has this theory that we existed, when I say we, I mean humanity, in the state of incredibly cruel and oppressive matriarchy for hundreds of thousands of years. And that patriarchy is essentially protracted, bitter, and violent revenge over women on account of them having treated men so poorly over, I say, a very long period of time. Now, this is Camille Paglia saying it, so yeah, if you have any issues with that, discuss it with her. She is luckily still alive and kicking. She is in great shape. The point is that if we're talking about these fetish figurines, they may be, instead of seeing them just as fertility fetishes, which is again what they may be, but we just don't know, they may be just made in celebration of women. Now, Camille Paglia explained this. She explains the whole matriarchy hypothesis that women had and still have this amazing capacity to produce children. And I guess this appeared to be, magical and amazing back in the day when we didn't necessarily have the full medical knowledge on how conception and birth are done, how they happen, what's the entire mechanism behind them. And she argues that women used this, rare quality to oppress men. It's if you want to continue existing, you have to treat your women right, and then they would take advantage of that. We could then assume that these female fetish figurines are just there to celebrate female as such. And they're just there to celebrate, the feminine principle, woman as such, woman with the capital W. Now, this is quite interesting because if we look at history of art, as we posited it, we can say, okay, the first item that we had selected is androgynous. We cannot really tell if Pebble of Makapansgat, I struggle to pronounce this to this day, and I will continue to do so. We cannot tell that if it's a male or a female face. It's impossible to say. It's asexual, it's androgynous. When it comes to the second item of our choice, Venus of Tantan, we can say that it looks very much like a woman. So we can be certain that it's a woman. From the very beginning, therefore, we have one item that can easily be a woman, we just don't know, and we have one item that is, for all intents and purposes, a woman. The third item that we're going to be dealing with is Venus of Berekat Ram, and that's also a woman. Now, let's say that then the fourth item that we're going to be dealing with is the mask of La Roche-Cotard, and we can't really say if this is a woman or a man. Again, it's not detailed enough for us to be able to say that. Now, why am I talking about these things in this particular key? Well, in the Bible, in the Old Testament, we have Genesis myth, the story, the explanation of how humanity was created, and the general assumption is that God created a man first. He created Adam, then he created Eve out of Adam's rib. Now, this is basically to give a man an elevated standing in this whole great scheme of things. God then tells the men and women, you are to obey your man, you're to do everything he says and all those things. So clearly we have this patriarchal idea that men come first, men are more important than women, they're the first to be created. We associate the whole idea of humanity with man and manhood and all of it. So that's the biblical narrative. But here we have a completely different situation. We here have, millions of years, possibly, but if not millions, hundreds of thousands of years, easily, where we create figurines of women. And you could say that, all these Venus figurines, they're all women. We can clearly tell that they are. And it's the case all up until the Lovenmensch figure that is something that we're going to be talking about. That is a figurine that is a half human, half lion, where, again, we can't really tell if it's a male or a female. It's just not detailed enough. We can say that it's half man, half lion, but that's as far as we can go. So even that can be a woman. Whereas all of these Venuses really are women. And this takes us to a completely different assumption, really, that it was woman that was created first and not man. which again would make sense if you want to connect it to this whole idea of, well, women being progenitors of life. Women are the ones who give birth. I mean, still. This is really something that takes us to the anthropological and biological exception or exceptional value of women. And this is something, again, that cannot be debated, that women are biologically more precious than men because they have a limited output of how many babies they can produce. They have a smaller fertility frame than men do. Now, this means that if you have, this is an example that we've given many times, we're going to give it many times in the future. If you have a community that dwindles down to 7 women and 1 man, that community stands a good chance of surviving, because that 1 man can make kids to these 7 women. Several times over, they can multiply enough for that community to survive. If, on the other end, your community dwindles down to 7 men and 1 woman, that community is doomed. There's just no way they can survive. That's it. End of the line for them. Now, these situations tell us that women are simply, in this particular regard, more precious than men. This is one of the reasons why men tend to go to war, why they tend to do dangerous, stupid things, not just because they are physically stronger and faster and more dexterous and all these other things, but because women are simply more important. They're more precious. This is the reason why when the ship is sinking, famously, women and children go first, because we are thinking about survival. Even in this particular moment in time where we are not necessarily in danger of going extinct, there's 8 billion people on the planet at this particular moment. We're recording this in February of 2026. But this impulse for survival is deeply rooted in our very bones, in our very being. So we're always thinking about maximizing the chances of survival of the entire species, not necessarily just of our particular person or family. Now, again, this is something that is quite interesting, because if we are to assume that this is one of the first works of art, and we are running with this assumption, we are analyzing it as a second work of art, although we are allowing a certain space for margin for consideration, thinking about it in terms of being a full, complete work of art or being something else entirely. But the point is that we have this whole different field of aesthetics that opens up, and the anthropological questioning of motivation, of why are we creating to begin with, and how the dominant creation myth that has to do with the dominant religion, or if you will, dominant 3 Abrahamic religions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, they both go from this premise that God created Adam and Eve. Not both, all 3 of them, sorry. All 3 of them go from this premise that God created Adam and Eve, and then Adam was created first, Eve was created second. But again, we're seeing a very different situation here. I want to go back to this whole thing when it comes to this being art or this not being art. I think this is a very important thing to address, because the reason why we think that this may be art, and why there is a big difference between this one and the first item that we've discussed, was this idea that we started acting upon stone here. This was not just a manoport. Most of it was found as it is. But then we had this impulse to improve it. We had this impulse to act upon it. So we recognized something, and we wanted to bring forth that particular quality by etching the stone further. Now, this is quite interesting, because if we're talking about stone tools, like arrow tips, for example, that start appearing 62,000 years before current time, we're talking about, again, a form of an applied art, where we have this tendency of making these arrow tips smoother than they need to be. We have this tendency to make them prettier than they need to be. We go past their function, and we venture into the realm of aesthetics. Now, this is, again, incredibly anachronous, because we're talking about aesthetics 300,000 years before it exists as a term. Really, aesthetics only starts being developed as a discipline and being used as a term in the late 18th century. But when I'm talking about aesthetics, of course, I'm talking about beauty. And we can say that these tools look nicer than they need to. These Acheulean hand axes and these arrow tips that come from 62,000 years ago. uh, we act on them to make them pretty even when we don't have to. And this, I think, is a beautiful thing in itself. Now, why am I also talking about this? Well, because, again, we go back to this whole idea of development of consciousness, that there is an involved additional step of creativity, of agency, of willingness to act upon nature, that we're not just going to recognize something and then bring it to our community for amusement or humor or worship or whichever other thing. No, we're going to act on that. That takes a certain willpower and takes a certain, I wouldn't say arrogance, but confidence, that you see a trait and you want to pursue it. And this is an incredibly artistic thing, because in our courses on What is Art, we were talking about material resisting artistic intervention, and we were talking about the importance of tools and importance of skill and all this, like spirit and matter dynamism and confrontation that results in beautiful things. You can say the same thing here, that there was a trait that was recognized in this particular, stone, and then that trait was pursued. We wanted to perfect it. We wanted to distill it. We wanted to make it come to surface better. And again, we go back to the famous quote of Michelangelo when he was explaining how he sculpts and how he acts. He said that he saw an angel trapped in stone and he decided to set it free. Now, of course, Michelangelo, being a high Renaissance sculptor and painter and all-around gifted, inspired artist, he was doing this on a much more advanced level than whichever artist or proto-artist was involved with etching the sides of Venus of Tantan. But the principle is the same. And this is what I'm trying to suggest here, that we're talking about an item that possibly predates Homo sapiens stage of development of humanity, but we have a trait that is seen as human. We have a trait of embellishment, of perfectioning, of creative endeavor, of pursuing an idea and wrestling with matter. Of course, very small piece of stone. We wrestle with matter. We want to accentuate that thing that we saw, which again tells us about a fairly developed capacity of abstract thought. And this was the main thing that we speculated upon when we were talking about the previous item. How is it possible for an Australopithecus to have abstract thought? Because we are not entirely certain that this stage of human development had that capacity. And again, when we're talking about this particular take on, history of art, we are talking about something that gives us an indication that we were much more developed than we previously thought. Now, why do I say that this is much more a work of art than the previous item, or there is less controversy about this possibly being a proto-work of art? And the answer would be exactly this: because there is agency, because this is something we've decided to work on. It was a received invitation. A certain form was seen, it was recognized, and then we decided to, basically bring it forth and to perfect it. This is something that is really, really important, because it speaks of, intent, of action, and it speaks of an individual or a proto-individual that has far more agency than, their ancestor from 2.5 million years ago. And this is something that then connects to our entire inquiry into what is art. And if we're thinking about, general history of art, this is something that helps us put a puzzle in a place. Because we can say, okay, if we are to say that this is more of a work of art than the previous item, then this means that we have a better idea of what art is. And this is how we define art, and this is how we decide to talk about it. Now, we also are talking about a very important division that was done here, that we have moved from the realm of androgyny, where we have just a very abstract depiction of a face, where we don't know if it's an animal or a human face, we don't know if it's a male or a female face. So we're talking about very broad indifferentiation, and this is something that we're going to be talking about a lot when it comes to our next item, the question of differentiation and how important it really is. The question of sexuality, it becomes really, really important. And of course, the question of fertility. But the point is that these things emerge as a topic. There is one further step towards better differentiation, because we can say, okay, this is a female body and it's an entire body. It's not just a face. If you represent just a face in a way that is either seen as a symbol or it's seen as a synecdoche. Synecdoche is a stylistical figure where you represent the whole with one part. Let's say you hear the sound of horse hooves and you have this like image of a horse, but you represent the entire horse through the sound of their hooves clapping on the road. This would be a synecdoche. And the symbol was already explained, I think, numerous times, but it's basically how you represent one complex set of affairs through one particular facet or through one particular meaning that then points towards other different meanings. We can say that the first work of art is more general in this regard because it's either a symbol or a synecdoche, but this one is less general, it's more defined, it's more separated and more differentiated. And these are all incredibly important things when we're talking about humanity, when we're talking about civilization as such, because we say, yes, this is the whole body, barring all of the other, all of the most important elements of identity and identification, like the face, like the hands, and like the feet, but it's a whole thing. And we are talking perhaps about the visual synecdoche, but in a different direction, where only the details are absent, whereas the whole thing is there. In the first case, we had a detail, a face, but then the whole thing was absent. Here, it's the other way around. So it's not that we chose this particular order so as to accentuate a point. This is really how it is. I mean, this is the chronology of works of art as they are. And if we were to talk about the next one that has the similar chronology to this one, Venus of Berekat Ram, it's also a body. So it's, it wouldn't really change that much in this regard. Now, we want to bring this to a conclusion because we only have 2 minutes left. We want to say that this is a really important step forward. And not necessarily because we adopt the idea of linear chronology or we adopt the idea of development. We perfectly allow for the notion of cyclical chronology, or we allow for the possibility of history of art or general human history not being a singular line of progress, not being a singular line of development. This is quite obvious if you look at late Roman art, that art really goes through centuries of apparent decadence or something that looks like decadence. We'll have the moment to discuss that. We can see statues becoming less and less detailed. We can see works of art becoming more and more abstract, but at the same time less sophisticated. So it's not like all of history of art is one long story of progress. And you could argue that this would not necessarily be progress at all. But what is important to say here is that it is a big drastic shift and it's a big change. And something that we want to be talking about is how, again, the human consciousness developed, how the usage of tools developed. And what is really important, and what we won't have much time to address here, we'll have to open it perhaps in the next chapter, is how the humans lived, how their material conditions shaped their thinking of the world, shaped their consciousness, and shaped their actions. So therefore, of course, it then influenced drastically how they saw themselves, how they created whatever they were creating. And the last thing to mention here, of course, is to repeat and to underline this whole business of beginning to act on nature in a more decisive form. Not just finding an object, but actually working on an object, no matter how rudimentary it may be. This is all for today. I thank you for your attention. The next one is going to be on Venus of Berekat Ram. It's also going to be a female figure, so we're going to stay with the topic for a while now. We're going to be talking about cult of femininity, cult of female sexuality, and all of that. Again, I thank you for your attention, and I hope to see you again soon.